A shepherd stands before the most powerful man on earth and says 4 words that, on the surface, sound like suicide. Pharaoh of Egypt controlled an empire that had stood for well over 1,000 years by the time this conversation happens, an empire with the largest standing army in the known world, temples to dozens of gods stretching from the Nile Delta to Nubia, and a religious system that declared Pharaoh himself to be a living god walking the earth. And Moses, a man who had spent the last 40 years tending sheep in the wilderness after fleeing Egypt as a fugitive, walks into that court and says, "On God's authority, let my people go." Exodus 5:1. Pharaoh's answer is recorded in the very next verse, and it tells you everything about the size of the confrontation about to unfold. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. Exodus 5:2. What follows over the next several chapters of Exodus isn't simply a series of disasters, it's a direct, deliberate answer to that exact question, delivered 10 separate times, until there is no version of Pharaoh's court left that can still claim not to know who the Lord is. Most people who've heard the story of the 10 plagues, whether from Sunday school or from a movie, remember them as a somewhat random string of disasters, blood, frogs, and so on, building toward the final, horrifying one. What almost nobody explains is that these 10 plagues were never random at all. Egypt in this era worshipped an enormous pantheon of gods, each one governing a specific domain of nature: the Nile, the sun, the crops, livestock, even Pharaoh's own body and life. And when you line up each plague against the specific Egyptian deity it directly confronted, a pattern emerges that Exodus itself points to explicitly. Exodus 12:12 records, God saying plainly, "Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." This wasn't 10 unrelated disasters thrown at a stubborn king. This was a systematic dismantling, one god at a time, of the entire religious structure propping up the most powerful empire on earth. Before we walk through them, it's worth understanding the shape of the confrontation itself. 9 times, Exodus records Pharaoh's heart being hardened, sometimes by his own choice, sometimes described as God hardening it directly, a tension scholars and theologians have debated for centuries. And 9 times, after a plague strikes, Pharaoh appears to relent, only to change his mind the moment the pressure lifts. The 10th plague breaks that entire cycle permanently, and by the time we reach it, you'll understand exactly why nothing short of that final blow could have ended this particular standoff. The first plague strikes the single most sacred body of water in the entire Egyptian religious system. Exodus 7:20 describes Aaron striking the Nile with his staff and the water throughout the entire river turning to blood, killing the fish and making the water impossible to drink. This wasn't a minor inconvenience in a desert civilization. Egypt's entire existence depended on the Nile's annual flooding for agriculture, and the river itself was personified as the god Hapi, the deity of the Nile's life-giving flood, along with Osiris, whose bloodstream the Nile was believed to actually be in certain Egyptian religious traditions. The very source Egypt worshipped as the giver of life turns instantly into something associated with death. The second plague targets Heket, the Egyptian goddess of fertility and childbirth, depicted with the head of a frog and closely associated with the Nile's annual flooding cycle, since frogs would appear in enormous numbers after the yearly floods receded. Exodus 8:6 describes frogs covering the entire land of Egypt, filling houses, bedrooms, ovens, and kneading bowls. What was normally a mild seasonal sign associated with a goddess of blessing and fertility becomes an overwhelming plague, the very symbol of that goddess turning into an unbearable infestation. The third plague, lice or gnats depending on the translation, Exodus 8:16 through 19, is short in the biblical text, but significant for a specific reason. This is the plague where Pharaoh's own magicians, who had managed to replicate the first two plagues through what the text describes as their secret arts, finally fail. Exodus 8:18 says they tried to produce lice and could not, and Exodus 8:19 records them telling Pharaoh directly, "This is the finger of God." Even Egypt's own religious professionals, men trained specifically to demonstrate power over the natural and spiritual world, hit a wall they couldn't get past. Some scholars connect this plague to Geb, the Egyptian god of the earth itself, since the plague originates directly from the dust of the ground. The fourth plague, swarms of flies, Exodus 8:24, likely targeted either Khepri, the scarab-headed god associated with flies and beetles, or possibly Uatchit, worshipped in fly form in certain regions. But the more significant detail in this fourth plague is a shift in how it's administered. From this point forward, the plagues stop striking Egypt indiscriminately and start demonstrating a clear, deliberate distinction between who is under judgment and who is not. The fifth plague strikes Egyptian livestock specifically, described in Exodus 9:3 through 6, as a severe pestilence killing horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep across the land, while Exodus 9:6 notes explicitly that not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. This plague directly confronts Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love and protection, and Apis, the sacred bull worshipped as a living incarnation of divine power, kept and venerated in an actual temple in Memphis. The animals Egypt worshipped as gods or as vessels for their gods drop dead in the fields, while the exact same categories of livestock, owned by the very people Pharaoh refuses to release, remain completely untouched. The sixth plague turns personal and physical in a new way. Exodus 9:8 through 11 describes Moses throwing ashes from a furnace into the air, and painful boils breaking out on people and animals throughout Egypt. This plague specifically confronts Sekhmet and Serapis, deities Egyptians turned to for protection against plague and disease, along with Imhotep, deified as a god of healing and medicine. And here is a detail worth sitting with. Exodus 9:11 records that Pharaoh's magicians, the same men who had managed partial imitations earlier, could not even stand before Moses because of the boils covering their own bodies. The professionals whose job was to intervene between Egypt and divine power are themselves incapacitated by the very judgment they're supposed to counter. The seventh plague escalates dramatically in scale. Exodus 9:23 through 25 describes a hailstorm mixed with fire, more devastating, the text says, than any hail Egypt had experienced since it became a nation, destroying crops, trees, and any people or animals left unsheltered in the open fields. This confronts Nut, the sky goddess, and Set, associated with storms and chaos, gods whose entire domain, the sky itself, becomes the exact instrument of the judgment against Egypt. And notice the pattern building. Exodus 9:26 again specifically notes that Goshen, where the Israelites lived, experienced no hail at all. The eighth plague follows almost immediately, before Egypt has any real chance to recover. Exodus 10:12 through 15 describes a locust swarm so dense it covers the surface of the entire land, consuming whatever crops the hail had left standing, until Exodus 10:15 says the land was darkened and nothing green remained on any tree or plant in all of Egypt. This confronted Sennacherib, the god believed to protect crops from insects, and possibly Osiris again in his role governing agriculture and fertility of the land. By this point, Pharaoh's own officials are recorded in Exodus 10:7 begging him directly, "How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed?" Even Pharaoh's inner circle has reached its breaking point before Pharaoh himself has. The 9th plague strikes at the very center of Egyptian religious identity. Exodus 10:21 through 23 describes a darkness so thick it could, in the text's own words, be felt, lasting 3 full days, so severe that people could not see one another or leave their homes, while Exodus 10:23 notes the Israelites had light in their dwellings throughout the entire period. This directly confronts Ra, the sun god, arguably the single most important deity in the entire Egyptian pantheon, the one Pharaoh himself was believed to be a direct descendant of. For 3 days, the most powerful and central god in Egypt's entire religious system simply fails to show up, and the empire sits in darkness it cannot explain or fix. And then comes the 10th and final plague, the one that finally breaks Pharaoh's resolve permanently. Exodus 11:4 and 5 records Moses delivering the warning directly that at midnight the Lord would go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn son would die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the lowest servant, to the firstborn of every animal. This final plague strikes directly at Pharaoh's own claimed divinity, since Pharaoh himself was believed to be the incarnation of Horus and the son of Ra, the guarantor of life and continuity for the entire nation, and it strikes at Osiris specifically in his role as judge over life and death, the exact domain Osiris was supposed to govern being overturned in a single night. Exodus 12 records the instructions given to Israel before this final plague arrives: a lamb without blemish, its blood applied to the doorposts and lintel of each home, so that when judgment passed through Egypt, it would pass over any house marked by that blood. Exodus 12:13, "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you." Exodus 12:30 records the aftermath. "There was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead." By that same night, Exodus 12:31 says, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron and finally tells them to leave, taking everyone and everything with them. If tracing these plagues in order and seeing exactly which Egyptian god each one confronted is opening something up for you, take a second to subscribe. Drop a comment on which plague stood out most, and share this with someone who's only ever heard this story told as 10 random disasters. Look at the progression as a whole instead of 10 separate disconnected events. The Nile turned to blood, striking the river Egypt depended on for its very existence, and the god believed to embody it. Frogs overwhelmed the land, turning a goddess of blessing into a plague. Lice defeated Pharaoh's own magicians outright, the first plague they couldn't fake. Flies arrived with an explicit division drawn between Egypt and Israel for the first time. Livestock died in the fields while Israel's animals were spared completely. Boils disabled the very professionals meant to intervene on Egypt's behalf. Hail destroyed what the earlier plagues left standing, falling everywhere except Goshen. Locusts finished off whatever the hail had missed, until Pharaoh's own officials begged him to relent before he would. 10 plagues, 10 confrontations, each one escalating in both scale and theological precision, moving steadily from Egypt's outer resources, its river, its crops, its livestock, toward its innermost claims, its magicians, its sky, its sun god, and finally its own living god, king sitting on the throne. This was never simply about forcing a stubborn ruler to release a group of slaves through sheer, overwhelming force. It was a methodical, escalating demonstration that every single power Egypt had ever trusted in, personified as a god and worshipped for over 1,000 years, had no actual authority in front of the God who was about to walk his people out of that country for good. It ended with a home marked by the blood of a lamb, judgment passing directly over the door, and a people who had nothing but that single mark of protection walking out free the very next morning. The plagues were never really about Egypt's gods failing under pressure. They were about revealing which god had never needed to compete with them in the first place. If this changed the way you see this story, take a second to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. That is genuinely how this reaches more people. Thank you for being here with us. Pray for us. God bless you.